The story of Final Fantasy XVI is one that feels slightly different to the games that came before it. It has a much darker and mature tone that's been described by the developers as inspired by Game of Thrones. There's blood, gore, and all around much more intense violence than you usually see in a Final Fantasy game. However, it never felt gratuitous. Anytime blood was spilled, it was in service of the story. Seeing the characters with blood spatter on their armor and swords never took me out of the moment. The characters are all masterfully written, with everyone having depth, rich histories, and gray areas when it comes to their own ideologies. Even side characters and NPCs have standout personalities and backstories. Much attention and care was put into crafting these characters and their performances. While everyone's performances are fantastic, I have to give a special shout out to Ben Starr as Clive Rosfield. The man devotes 200% of his energy into his performances as teenage, mid-20s, and early 30s Clive, giving us a nuanced and complex perspective on Clive. He has trauma, guilt, snark, and just wants to do right by everyone. He is a Final Fantasy protagonist through and through.
I fight to build a new world now. A better world, where men can live and die on their own terms.
Now, I've never given out an award before, but with this review, I will be debuting the Curious Corduroy Ultima Award for Outstanding Performance to the wonderful Ben Starr. Now, I don't have a physical award to send out, but if Ben should ever come across this video, then you can feel free to screenshot the JPEG of the award and maybe print it out on some nice paper and get it laminated. You definitely delivered an iconic performance, Mr. Starr. Now, the story is very dark and dour, with some moments being downright disturbing. However, that does not mean that there aren't moments of levity to be found sprinkled throughout the game. Some characters show up throughout Clive's journey and add a much needed splash of color and humor to the at times oppressive world. Banter between the characters and cutscenes and battles helps to break up the darkness of the game's story in a way that never feels wacky or out of place. Hearing Clive deliver a sarcastic line with his gruff tone of voice and duh kind of reaction definitely got a laugh out of me.
Something has spotted us, Torgal. What am I saying? Of course it has. There's a floating eyeball.
Clive, my boy, even life's smallest challenges offer the opportunity to grow and to change. You must embrace these moments. Allow them to suffuse your heart with a deep sense of fulfillment.
Narrowly escaping death at the hands of an enemy is not my idea of fulfillment.
My one issue with the characters is that I wish we got to spend more time with them, especially the core trio of Clive, Cid, and Jill. The chemistry between the characters and actors is palpable and contributes to the levity of the story. Unfortunately, you just don't spend enough time with them. Characters show up and then when the time comes, they split from Clive and go their separate ways. One character arc in particular is incredibly short, which is unfortunate because the character in question is incredibly complex, and I wanted to know more about their backstory and history with some of the other characters. The story does have massive pacing issues though. The game opens up like an insane, roided out roller coaster ride, grabbing the player by the neck and not letting go. Mystery, intrigue, politics, Dan Cortez, and character relationships are all established in meaningful and engrossing ways. You can't help but be attached to these characters from the get-go and want to see where they end up in the story. But in the first 25% of the game, the roller coaster of a story comes to a grinding halt, and the main story quest leads Clive to an area that feels like unnecessary padding. The quest goes from let's save the world to Clive becoming a detective and needing to solve a missing persons case. The main questline here really feels like it could have been omitted or transformed into an optional side quest instead, especially since the events and characters in this section don't have much of an effect on the story moving forward. There's also points in the story later on where Clive's journey to an area is talked about briefly in cutscene, and then poof, the next cutscene hits and Clive is already at his destination, clearly showing that some areas could have been removed completely in order to keep up the pace of the story. The game's pacing also struggles in the latter latter half of the game, with a lot of the MMORPG type quest lines becoming mainline missions, and Clive spending most of his time running errands and talking to people. The overall story, big set pieces, and meaningful cutscenes in the game are fantastic, but the stuff in between that, unfortunately, gets boring fast and the game starts to crawl. 16's story definitely touches on real-world politics, social issues, and sexuality, with the major gaps in the class system and how people are treated for being born different and looking a certain way. Props to Yoshi P and CBU3 for tackling this type of subject matter and not changing anything to appease certain areas of the world. Now, because there are so many characters and events in this game, trying to keep up with the story can feel a bit overwhelming, but this is where things like active time lore and characters like Harpocrates and Vivian Ninetails come into play. The ATL system allows the player to pause the game and hold down the touchpad on the DualSense controller during most cutscenes to bring up a briefing screen that explains the characters and situations currently being referenced in the story. Being able to do this on the fly allowed for quick explainers on the game's story. Characters like Harpocrates, who the characters refer to as tomes, and Vivian are tasked with organizing story and world events. Clive can speak with Harpocrates to tell him of his journeys, which then creates a glossary of all the characters, locations, events, and even words that have been introduced in the story. If you want to know every detail about an icon and how they work, Harpocrates is the man for you. Vivian keeps the state of the realm updated for the player, keeping track of on and off-screen events, character webs that detail all character relationships and stature, as well as what kingdoms have gone to war or been destroyed. I'm pretty sure somewhere in there she also tracks the characters' eating habits. To say these systems are comprehensive is putting it lightly. Unfortunately, Vivian's cutscenes require her to be the exposition for the game, with her scenes often explaining the slightly convoluted events between kingdoms, battles, and characters. It's all very dry and repetitive. Polygon described Final Fantasy XVI as a slick modern epic with the soul of a PS2 game. The latter part might sound like a negative to some, but it's definitely not. You have your decent-sized hub area to talk to your NPCs and conduct various affairs, and you have a very basic world map that allows you to fast travel to different levels in the game. These levels, or zones, vary in size from small and linear to large and slightly more open. Some areas are strictly story missions, while others allow you to hunt monsters and accept side quests. Now, speaking of side quests, they're probably my least favorite part of the game. Most of them are all bottom-of-the-barrel MMORPG type quests that require Clive to find an ingredient for an herbal remedy, track down a missing person, or clear out monsters from specific areas to allow for safe travel for the residents of that area. There's also a large amount of side quests that require Clive to deliver food to other characters. I'm not sure if that's an inside joke or what that's about, but it seemed kinda odd. But just because the side quests themselves are bland, that doesn't mean they're all meaningless. Some do offer really great lore and world building of the land and its inhabitants. Others are particularly heartfelt and sad and build upon the main cast of characters and even side characters' backstories. These payoffs are rare, but much welcomed when they occur. Even with the not so great side quests, the main story structure of 16 is a much welcomed reprieve from the other AAA open world games that at times can feel overwhelming with the amount of things you can do. Sometimes it's nice to get back to basics.
You're just a big puppy, aren't you? A very big puppy.
As far as performance and graphics go, it's a mixed bag. The visuals are outstanding, with many of the cutscenes taking place in-game with a stunning visual fidelity. Characters look impressive, and even their armor and clothes all stand out to an impressive degree. The icons have an insane amount of detail on their character models as well, with many having unique lighting and particle effects ingrained in them. I also have to give a huge shout out to the Titan Icon boss battle. The stuff happening on screen during this battle is absolutely insane, and I'm not sure how my PS5 didn't explode while I was playing. It's truly epic and really showcases why this game is a PlayStation 5 exclusive. Unfortunately, the game has issues with its performance mode, namely the frame rate. Traveling through small towns and even open areas caused the frame rate to drop from 60 to somewhere in the 40s consistently. The flip side of that are set pieces that have a ton of particle and weather effects happening. Even with wind, storms, flying debris, and icons on screen, the frame frame rate never buckled in these spots. It feels like the performance mode was never intended to be part of the game, but because so many people requested it, they decided to add it in later in development and weren't able to properly optimize it. As of right now, there are no updates addressing the game's frame rate. The combat in this game is deceptively deep. Combos and abilities at first glance might seem shallow, but the further you progress into the game and the more enemies you encounter, combat really starts to show how deep it can actually be. Clive is incredibly responsive, and the ability to alternate between physical and magic attacks takes a bit of getting used to, but once you find your rhythm, it becomes second nature. Clive also has access to 3 different icons in battle, using L2 to switch between them and using square and triangle to activate each ability, with all abilities having specific cooldown times to avoid spamming them too much. Some iconic abilities are extremely overpowered though. I'm talking strong AoE type attacks that can obliterate large groups of enemies in seconds. After a while, I stopped using those abilities in favor of some of the smaller attacks. The developers stated that they toyed around with the idea of allowing players to use more than 3 icons at a time, but they found that 3 was the right balance for most players, especially those who aren't as familiar with action games. Icon battles also offer a refreshing change of pace from normal fights. Playing as Ifrit in these massive cinematic battles feels like a power trip. Ifrit, while massive and heavy, is surprisingly agile, and the mobility with his character is addictively fun. Dodging and sliding around always felt satisfying. Each encounter is different as well. For example, a battle against Garuda mechanically will be different than a battle with Bahamut. These fights scream high budget. From the gameplay to its visual direction, they are absolute standout sections in the game. And again, I have to mention the Titan Icon boss battle. This fight might be the craziest, most impressive boss battle I've ever experienced in a video game, and that is not hyperbole. Think Asura's Wrath meets God of War boss battles, cranked to 11 and dosed with steroids and 400 milligrams of caffeine. It is absolutely insane and must be experienced. It's one of the best boss encounters in a game, and it absolutely pushes the PlayStation 5 to its limits and then some. On top of that, the icon battles after that continue to get even crazier. Now, to my least favorite part of combat, and that is the difficulty. The game unfortunately leans towards the easier side of things, with most battles not feeling as difficult as they should. Groups of enemies will often stand and wait their turn to attack you, resulting in the player just being able to mow down waves of enemies without too much of a challenge. Fighting the smaller jobber-type enemies grew repetitive fast since they have no stagger bar and can be whacked to death easily. However, the bigger enemies that do have stagger bars is where the fun is at. Some bosses do put up a good fight though, striking a nice balance between aggressive AI and fast attacks. The boss battles also borrow heavily from Final Fantasy XIV, with many enemies having circular arenas and massive AoE attacks. But if you want to talk about challenge and really having fun with the game's combat, let's talk about the hunts. The hunt system and battles in this game are my absolute favorite part of the game's combat. Hunts periodically show up in the hunting board in your hub area. You're given basic information about the enemy mark and a general location on where it is. What's really nice is that the game doesn't hold your hand and lead you to the mark. You still have to track down the monster on your own before you can fight it. The difficulty of the hunt battles is what I wanted from the main game's story battles. Enemies are aggressive, fast, and varied with their abilities and enemy types. They really force you to analyze attack patterns and plan your attacks strategically. You can't button mash your way through these fights or you'll end up in the ground. Also, the music that accompanies you in every hunt battle is probably my favorite battle theme in the game. Overall, I wish the main action-based difficulty was a bit harder. The developers have said that they intentionally made the game easy because they want your first playthrough to focus on the story. And then, once you finish it, you can do the harder Final Fantasy mode difficulty. That mode does have more difficult enemies and even different enemy placement, but it's also a New Game Plus mode, meaning that you'll have a powerful and kitted out Clive that won't have much of a problem cutting through the enemies. I'm not asking for a Clive must die mode or anything, but games like Elden Ring, Devil May Cry 5, and God of War Ragnarok have proved that gamers don't mind a challenge, and I really wish the developers would have given us the benefit of the doubt when it came to the game's difficulty.
That monster's taken quite a liking to Lady Karen.
He's not a monster, he's Torgal. And he'd take a liking to you too if you gave him as many nuts as Nan does.
Last but certainly not least is the game's impeccable soundtrack, composed by the incredible Masayoshi Soken, who has previously done music for Final Fantasy XIV. After listening to this game's music, it's clear that Soken was able to pay tribute to the Final Fantasy composers that came before him, while also carving out his own path with his signature style. For example, the intro to the game's leading battle theme sounds very familiar to the opening of Final Fantasy VIII's battle theme, Don't Be Afraid, composed by legendary and veteran Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu. As the song transition, it turns into something out of Final Fantasy XV with the signature piano and strings of the incredible Yoko Shimomura gliding through. Soken and his team have done what is difficult to do, paying homage to those who came before, while also creating music that perfectly represents the world of 16. There's so many amazing songs in this game that I'll probably do a separate video gushing about the soundtrack.
Come to me, Ifrit!
All in all, Final Fantasy XVI may not be a masterpiece, but it is still a fantastic game. Its negatives aren't enough to detract from the overall experience. It contains incredible combat, deep and rich characters with powerful performances, phenomenal music, and a world that feels fully realized. If you are a Final Fantasy fan to any degree, then this is a game you should absolutely experience for yourself.